Dr. Lennox.
Dober večer, Slovenija. Thank you very much for your invitation to speak in your culture center in Ljubljana. I was last here in 1966. And I am delighted to be back again. And I feel very much at home because I come from a country that I think may be slightly smaller than yours, and that is Northern Ireland. And I always feel as I travel around the world that there's a sympathy between people who come from small countries. But I'm not going to go into the difficulties associated with that philosophical concept. And looking, I'm so encouraged to see so many of you here, which is a tribute to all the hard work that's been done by the organizers, but is also an indication of the interest in these topics. And I discover virtually in every country I go to that similar audiences come. I'm certainly not like the bishop in England who was visiting a little country church on his annual visit. And as he climbed up into the pulpit, he noticed there were only 3 old people in the audience. And just behind him was the local minister, and he whispered to him, and he said, "Did you tell them I was coming?" And the local minister said, "No, but word seems to have got around." So I'm delighted I'm not like that. And you've given me a very interesting title. And I'm grateful again to whoever translated the version of the talk that I sent in advance. What I say tonight will be similar and related, I hope. But there is more in the little booklet that you have been given than I will be able to say. And that's a very good thing, because what I'm looking forward to tonight is the end of my talk and the opportunity to listen to your questions. That's always, for me, the most interesting part. So please do write your questions out, and we'll try to answer as many of them as we can. The title you've given me is The Higgs Boson, God of the Gaps. And for those of us in England, 2 weeks ago, it was very exciting to learn that Peter Higgs had been awarded the Nobel Prize. Many years ago, he predicted that there would be a special particle. And during the years afterwards, a lot of work has gone into, first of all, working out the mathematics, and then using the vastly expensive instruments in CERN in Geneva, culminating in the discovery of the Higgs boson. It is a theme that is very up to date. This is Austria's leading weekly magazine. It appeared yesterday, and it was handed to me about an hour before I gave a lecture in the Technical University in Vienna. Schöpfung ohne Gott, creation without God, no question mark, no full stop, but it is about the Higgs boson. Interestingly, some people have called the Higgs boson the God particle. Professor Higgs does not like that description. And I don't like it either, and no serious scientist likes it. Professor Higgs is an atheist. I am a Christian believer. But we share that idea that calling it the God particle is actually very silly. It is a very exciting discovery. And as this article suggests, it's not the end of physics, it's the beginning of a new era in physics. As the last building block, so it is believed, fitting into the standard model and giving some kind of explanation of how it is that mass exists. Now, these concepts are extremely difficult, and I am not presuming that you know mathematics or physics. I speak to you as a pure mathematician. I did study theoretical physics at Cambridge many years ago. But what I want to do is to talk to you not about the details of the science, but about the implications and the conclusions that people are drawing from the science. And I hope that that's going to be accessible to everybody. Not long ago, I received an invitation to go to Geneva, to CERN, to engage with about 50 physicists who'd worked on the Higgs problem, mathematicians, philosophers, some theologians. And the idea was, can we find a language to talk to each other? Now, this is very interesting because it had never happened before. The director of CERN, who stayed for the whole conference, was interested in the philosophical and theological implications, if any, of this discovery. And we had a fascinating few days. And it was rapidly perceived that although we all shared the same commitment to science, we had very different underlying worldviews. Now, in orientating ourselves in this debate, because the title of this magazine, Creation Without God, seems at least to remind us of a tension or a conflict that exists in many people's minds. Indeed, it is the title of my book, Has Science Buried God? I want to suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, that there is a deeper question in a way. The conflict, and there is a real one, is not between science and belief in God. After all, we owe modern science to belief in God. That may surprise some of you. But it is the fact, and is supported by many of my colleagues who are historians of science, that if you look at the 17th century and you think about science arising under people like Galileo, Kepler, Newton, and so on, they were all believers in God. And there is a connection, as was expressed by Sir Alfred North Whitehead, the brilliant historian and philosopher of science. And summing up what he said, C.S. Lewis wrote, men became scientific. Why? Because they expected law in nature. And they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. That is, it was belief in God as the underlying worldview that was the motor that drove the rise of contemporary science. Let me put that in a slightly provocative way. I am not remotely ashamed to say to you tonight that I am both a scientist and a Christian, because arguably Christianity gave me my subject. So what has happened in the meantime? Because behind our title, the Higgs boson, God of the Gaps, is the contemporary feeling in the West and in the academy that somehow science and God don't belong together. Well, I want to suggest that they do belong together, but that the conflict, and there's a real conflict, is between two world views. You can see that. Peter Higgs, brilliant physicist, Nobel Prize winner 2013. He's an atheist. William Phillips, whom I met not long ago in Oxford, is a brilliant physicist too, Nobel Prize winner, and he's a Christian. Now that ought to tell us something. What does it tell us? It tells us that the real problem cannot lie between science and belief in God. No. The difference between those two distinguished Nobel Prize winners is not their science, it's their worldview. One is a Christian, a theist who believes in God, and the other is an atheist. So the real question is, where does science sit? Does it really point towards atheism? Or does it, as Isaac Newton and Kepler and Galileo and Clerk Maxwell believed, does it point towards God? And we can ask questions about the evidence for that as we go along. So I think we need to get rid of this idea that science and belief in God are in essential conflict. There are equally distinguished scientists in our world who are atheists and who are not atheists, who are theists. So that's the start of the situation. And it was very fascinating to me to engage in discussion with people who were actually involved in setting up the particle accelerator and in discovering the Higgs boson. And I'm going to share with you some things that scientists are saying. Now, Stephen Hawking is arguably the most famous living scientist. For many years, he left us in suspense. One didn't really know whether he left a little space for God or not, until recently, when he co-authored a book called The Grand Design with Leonard Mlodinow, in which he clearly states his atheism. And it hit the headlines all around the world. Stephen Hawking says physics leaves no room for God, and so on. So, according to him, there's no space for God because the laws of physics are the real explanation of the existence of the universe. More recently, Lawrence Krauss, a professor of physics at Arizona State University, very well known for his book, A Universe from Nothing, and he was another of the participants at this conference. When he read about the Higgs, wrote an article in one of the British newspapers saying that the Higgs boson is arguably more important than God. And I was tempted and gave in to the temptation. I wrote a reply to that appeared in the London Times, and you can see it on the internet. The Higgs boson is arguably more important than God. Is that true? What could that kind of thing mean? Well, let's first look at the idea that stands behind it. As I travel around, particularly the West, I discover that in many universities and in the media and among the population, there is an impression that science is now the only way to truth. The only really reliable way to get knowledge about our world is through science. Now, science has an immense cultural authority, and rightly so. We are all so grateful. There might even be people sitting twittering and tweeting as I'm talking to them here on all these marvelous iPhones and everything else. We're all very grateful to science and technology. But it's very important, ladies and gentlemen, to realize that there is more to the world than science. You see, if you think that science is the only way to truth, you will go a step further and you will end up believing that science is coextensive with rationality. That is a fatal mistake. But let's look at the first thing. We call it scientism. Science is the only way to truth. Bertrand Russell, the famous philosopher and mathematician, put it this way: what science cannot tell us, mankind cannot know. That sounds very impressive. And he was a wonderful logician, but his logic left him at this point. Because, and I hope it's not too late at night for logic, ladies and gentlemen, because the statement, what science cannot tell us, mankind cannot know, is not a statement of science. So if it's true, you cannot know it's true. Have you got that? It's logically incoherent. It goes too far. And it was a Nobel Prize winner, Peter Medawar, in Oxford, who put the record straight by saying there is no quicker way of bringing down criticism against science by claiming that science can answer every question. It is obvious that there are questions that science cannot touch. For instance, and he gave these examples, the simple questions of a child. Where did I come from? Where am I going to? What is the meaning of my life? And he said it's to literature and philosophy and religion that we must turn for answer to these things. Ladies and gentlemen, we're in a culture center tonight. If science is the only way to truth, you'd have to shut this place down. And you'd have to shut down half the faculties in your university. Where would history go? Anthropology, art, music, languages, literature, and so on. They would disappear. Einstein saw the point. And he put it this way. He said, you can speak of the ethical foundations of science, but you cannot speak of the scientific foundations of ethics. And he saw that you cannot answer ethical questions by science. Now, that's a huge contemporary debate, incidentally. But that's not the topic of my lecture tonight. But it's a very important one, because there's such an ingrained impression that science is the only way to truth that some people are now claiming, including Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris, that science can solve the age-old ethical dilemma of David Hume. I don't think it can, but that would take us too far from our subject tonight. We want to get back, and I'm going to use Stephen Hawking because it's a very useful thing to do, because his book is very clear about certain issues. He raises the interesting questions at the beginning of the book. How can we understand the world? What is the nature of reality? Where did it come from? Does the universe need a creator? And as you read it, and as I read it for the first time, I thought this is going to be very interesting, to hear a world-class scientist address the big philosophical questions. But when I read about 2 sentences further, I got a shock. And the shock was to read this. Traditionally, Hawking said, these are questions for philosophy. But philosophy is dead. It has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly in physics. As a result, scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. So there's your scientism. Philosophy is dead, it says on page 5 of the book, and the rest of the book is about philosophy. That struck me as rather strange, to say the least. Hawking's statement about philosophy is itself a philosophical statement. It's certainly not a statement of science. It blatantly contradicts itself. So, scientism we can dismiss without losing any respect for science itself. But now comes the next step, Hawking's dismissal of God. I want you to listen carefully to this because it shows a deep misunderstanding that characterizes a great deal of the debate. Hawking writes, ignorance of nature led people in ancient times to invent gods. This began to change, he suggests, with ancient Greek thinkers like Thales of Miletus about 2,600 years ago. The idea arose that nature follows consistent principles that could be deciphered. And so began, says Hawking, the long process of replacing the notion of the reign of the gods with the concept of the notion of a universe that is governed by laws of nature and created according to a blueprint we could someday learn to read. That means that Hawking is making two fundamental mistakes. Firstly, he is thinking of God or the gods as gods of the gaps. Remember our title, The Higgs Boson and God of the Gaps. What is this God of the gaps? Well, it's a very simple notion, and it's a very important notion. It's using God as a placeholder, as a substitute for a scientific explanation. Let me give you an example. The ancient Greeks were very frightened of thunder and lightning because they thought the gods were angry. If you do some atmospheric physics and learn a little bit about electrical discharges and so on, you soon can discover that it's got nothing to do with the anger of any gods. So those gods disappear when you give a scientific explanation in terms of atmospheric physics. And so the idea is this, that when I mention God, I simply mean, I can't explain it, therefore God did it. Now, that is a fundamental mistake, but it's so dangerous because it leads to Hawking and many other people today not understanding what I would mean by the concept of God. You see, ladies and gentlemen, the choice that Stephen Hawking offers you and me is this. You must choose between God and science. You can't have both. And I was puzzled for a long time to understand why that choice. And then it occurred to me it's because of his concept of God. You see, if you define God to be what I can't yet explain by science, then of course you've got to choose between God and science from the way you've defined God. Now, this is fascinating to me. In other words, you're giving people a choice, but the choice is between a non-existent entity and science. But what if God is not a God of the gaps, but is God of the whole show? God of the bits we do understand and the bits we don't understand. Let me put it this way. Now, God of the gaps thinking is very subtle, but let me put it in general. When in the days of Kepler and Newton, say the law of gravitation was discovered, that didn't mean that people said, we don't need God anymore, we've got a law. No. In fact, Newton dedicated his Principia Mathematica, the most brilliant book in the history of science, which explained these laws in the hope that the thinking person would come to believe in a deity. You see, because the idea is this: the more you understand of science, the more you admire the genius of the God that did it that way, not the less. But that's the way we all think. The more you know about engineering, the more you can admire a Rolls-Royce engine, not the less. The more you understand about art, the more you can admire a Rembrandt and understand it, not the less. And so therefore, I would want to emphasize that my position as a Christian is, no, not the God of the gaps. God is the God of the whole show, the God whom I admire more and more, the more I understand of the science of the way in which the world works. So that's the first thing to clear up. There's a false idea about God. There's another false idea about God lurking in there, because he goes back to the Greek gods. Now, I do a bit of debating, as some of you know, and last year I was invited to debate at the Oxford Union. We dress up in dinner jackets, and it's a parliamentary kind of debate. So the House splits, and there's the opposition. So the atheists were there, including Richard Dawkins, although he didn't debate. And I and my colleagues were faced with the following argument. I was very surprised to hear it in the Oxford Union, but nonetheless, I heard it there. And the argument was this. You see, they addressed us, me, and said, you are an atheist with regard to Artemis. You don't believe in Baal. You don't believe in Zeus. And they went through a whole list. And then with a great grin, they said, we just go one God more. And we dismissed Jehovah, the God of the Bible. And I thought that shows a deep misunderstanding, like Hawking. Because what they're claiming is that the God of the Bible is like one of those ancient gods, but he's not. Werner Jaeger was one of the most distinguished experts in the gods of antiquity. And I'm very interested in the gods of antiquity, the Assyrian, Babylonian, Egyptian, Greek, and Roman gods. And what he says about them is very interesting. He says this: the vast difference between those gods and the God of the Bible is very simply explained. They were all descended from the universe. The God of the Bible created the universe. Now, what is meant by that, descended from the universe? What's meant by that is this, that when you do some research onto the nature of those gods, you find that they, let me take one example, I think it's the Babylonian or the Egyptian, they come out of a primeval sea. That's one explanation. That is, they are ultimately material gods. They're part of the stuff of the universe. The God of the Bible is not part of the stuff of the universe. He invented the universe. And so to put God in that category is false. So there are two mistakes. And the lesson for me is this, that when I'm discussing these things in public, I need to check carefully what God we're talking about. Otherwise, we'll not make sense to each other. Now, I have mentioned the false concept of God as a God of the gaps, or as a God like the Greek gods. But now let me come to false concepts of science. And here the key word is explanation. What does it mean to explain something? What does it mean to explain something scientifically? When I was at school, I was so excited when I first found out about Newton's second law. To think that you could compress this concept of the attraction between bodies at a distance into 8 symbols and deduce from that equation all the elliptical motions of the planets that Kepler had observed, to my mind was stunning. And it's something I got great joy in my life in explaining to students. Just that sheer joy of discovering that the mathematical description worked and you could deduce all this stuff from it. But you know, I made a mistake. I thought, when I first met the law of gravity, that I knew what gravity was. But nobody knows what it is. You see, the law of gravity is an explanation, but it doesn't tell you what gravity is. Newton realized that. But we feel that once you've got a law, then you have explanation in its totality. That is far from the truth. What you can do, of course, and it's wonderful, is just with Newton, without Einstein, you can land a person on the moon. You can make wonderfully complex calculations, but you don't know what gravity is. Wittgenstein saw it, and he put it very well. He said, the basic deception of modernism is the illusion that the laws of nature are explanations of the phenomena of nature. They're not, they're just descriptions. Now that ought to make us humble when it comes to what we mean by explanation, but there's more to come. And the more to come is this, that again people are told you've got to choose between science and God. Once you've got a scientific explanation, you don't need God. But that is to misunderstand completely what you mean by an explanation. Let me put it into another sphere. So imagine we've got a Ford motor car engine here sitting. And I'm lecturing you on this engine. And I say, ladies and gentlemen, we're interested in explaining this engine. So I'm going to offer you two kinds of explanation. One is in terms of mechanical engineering and the law of internal combustion. The other is Henry Ford. Choose. Well, I hear some people laughing kindly. That's absurd. Now, let's think about that a little bit. Because the law of internal combustion and mechanical engineering are an explanation of that motor. So is Henry Ford. It wouldn't exist without him. But what's the difference, ladies and gentlemen? It's clear that if you want a holistic description of that engine, you must have both. And you'll notice, by the way, that they don't conflict with each other. They don't compete with each other. They complement each other. The point being that Henry Ford, who was very real, is not a scientific explanation. He's a personal agent explanation. Now, it would be ludicrous, ridiculous, and absurd for me to say, because I can explain at the level of science how that motor works in terms of mechanical engineering and the law of internal combustion, I don't need Henry Ford, thank you. That would be silly. It seems to me it's equally silly to say, because I've got a law of gravity, because I've got the Higgs boson, because I've got this, I don't need God. Because God is not the same kind of explanation. He's no less real, of course. In fact, there'd be no universe for physicists to do physics in if God hadn't made the thing. Do we get that point? It's very important. These are simple points, actually, but they lie at the heart of a public confusion. And it's not only the general public, it's many of my scientific colleagues who don't learn to distinguish different levels of explanation that fit together. They don't compete, they don't conflict, but they give us a complementary explanation. So, go back to Lawrence Krauss's statement. The Higgs boson is arguably more important than God. My response to that was to say, for what? The Higgs boson is arguably more important than God if you're giving a lecture on subatomic physics and explaining how the particles fit in. But if the question is, how does a universe exist in which Higgs bosons come to be, then God is arguably more important than the Higgs boson. And at the end of my article, I risked being slightly cheeky because I'm Irish, you see. And we got a sense of humor. I said, what shall we say about the Higgs boson? Well, I said, Higgs predicted it. CERN discovered it. God created it. We celebrate the first two. What about the third? And that's exactly the point. And I would want to argue that those three statements are all valid. They do not contradict one another. And that's why I'm delighted to be a scientist, because the little I understand so little. The little I understand just makes me rejoice because it gives me an insight into the genius of the Creator that stands behind this universe. Now, one of the very exciting things, now I'm very old, I gave that away. I told you I was here in 1966. I shouldn't have done that. But anyway, I existed a bit before that as well. And I arrived in Cambridge in 1962. That was a very exciting time to do mathematics at Cambridge because at that time the first evidence came in that there was a beginning to space-time. The so-called Big Bang theory, the standard model. And the evidence was coming in. Now, here's the interesting thing. Now virtually every scientist accepts it. But then they didn't. In fact, it was resisted. And it was resisted by some of the most distinguished scientists in England. The editor of Nature, which is the most famous scientific periodical in the world, said in his editorial, we must resist this idea of a beginning. Why? Because it will give too much support to people who believe the Bible. Now, isn't this interesting, ladies and gentlemen? I actually lived to see this, that you had a major scientific advance, for which Arno Penzias, amongst others, got the Nobel Prize, resisted by a scientist because it was too close to what the Bible had been saying for centuries. And I raised this with Richard Dawkins in one of our debates, and he was not impressed. He said, look, he said, come on. He said, either there was a beginning or there wasn't. There's a 50-50 chance. So what's the big deal? I said, the big deal is, Richard, it wasn't settled by throwing a dice. It took massive scientific argument to get people to move away from Aristotle's view that the mass energy was eternal, the universe had always existed. It took massive scientific evidence because it was resisted. These things are not settled by guesswork at all. So, contemporary science now accepts, with many nuances that are very complex, that there was a beginning. I had the wonderful opportunity of debating Alan Guth a couple of years ago, who's the father of inflation theory. If you don't know what that is, that's all right. But it's something to do with what happened just after the Big Bang. And in the audience was Alex Vilenkin, very distinguished Ukrainian, now American mathematician. And I was talking about this notion of a beginning, and he referred me to his work. And it says this: it is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, now this is very interesting, and he's writing it fully aware of theories of a multiverse and all of this. He says this: cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. I find that interesting. Some people say to me, you know, the Bible is useless because it makes no predictions. Well, I suppose I understand what they mean, but I disagree with them. It tells us that there was a beginning. It's been saying it for thousands of years. And I'm bold enough sometimes to say to my colleagues, you know, if we'd taken it more seriously, we might have looked for evidence that there was a beginning much earlier than we did. It doesn't say a lot about science. It's not a scientific textbook. Of course it isn't. I don't teach algebra from the book of Leviticus, nowhere. But it does talk about the origins of our physical universe, the same universe that science is talking about. And it says there was a beginning. Now, what's fascinating about that is this. Well, it's the question we all ask. What was before that, when that means anything? And now we get a chorus of people telling us that the universe came from nothing. Now, I wish now to talk about nothing. It is a very important topic, nothing. But I warn you, I'm going to do that. But before I do, let me just give you an insight into what some of the world's leading scientists said about that beginning. It's very interesting. Arno Penzias, I mentioned before, and he is just one very remarkable person. And he talks about astronomy leaving us with a singularity, a beginning, a universe from nothing, with such a precise fine-tuning that one could almost say that behind it there's a supernatural plan. Alan Sandage. Alan Sandage is often regarded as the father of modern astronomy. He discovered the quasar. What did he say? He said, I find it quite improbable that such order came out of chaos. There has to be some organizing principle. God, to me, is a mystery, but is the explanation for the miracle of existence, why there is something rather than nothing. And this is the question. This is a key philosophical question, much loved by philosophers. But it's very interesting. Why is it that there's something rather than nothing? And if you're driven by your physics to claim that it starts with nothing, how do you get from nothing to something? Well, I'll tell you how they do it today. They redefine nothing. Now, that to me is extremely interesting. You see, as a Christian, I believe that the universe didn't come from nothing. It came from the creative hand of God. But now if you reject the existence of an eternal God, you've got nothing at any level. And so you have to invent some way of solving it. Now, Stephen Hawking's book, the main question addressed is this question, why there's something rather than nothing. And it was when I first read his answer to this that I got extremely interested. So let me share his answer. It goes like this. Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Pardon? Well, let me say it again. Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. So because there is something, a law of gravity, the universe will create itself from nothing. Contradiction number one. That's astonishing, ladies and gentlemen. But it's worse still. Because there is a law of gravity, not gravity, a law of gravity. Do laws create anything? Newton's laws of motion, do they move anything? Of course they don't. You see the billiard ball on the table. The law of motion doesn't move it. A cue does, hit by a person. This now opens up a window into some very profound misunderstandings. I had a conversation once with a very famous atheist colleague of mine, Peter Atkins, professor of physical chemistry. And I casually asked him, I said, Peter, what do you think created the universe? And without hesitation, he said mathematics. So I laughed, which perhaps wasn't the politest thing to do, but I just couldn't help it. And he said, "Why are you laughing?" I said, "Peter, I am a mathematician, and that's about the silliest thing I've ever heard in my life." He said, "Why?" I said, "Listen, 2 plus 2 equals 4. Did that ever put €4 in your pocket?" Don't laugh too quickly. Some bankers believe that, you see. You have heard of creative accounting, haven't you? And we've had a massive financial crisis precisely because some people believed that by creating sophisticated, abstract mathematical financial systems, you could create money. But that's another topic for another time. I wouldn't risk going down that road. But you get the point, ladies and gentlemen. 2 plus 2 equals 4. Well, if you've got €2 and €2, you've got 4. But it won't give you the euros. Because laws are generally of this form. If you have A, then you'll get B. But you've got to get A first. That's very simple stuff. So I'm staggered to read this, but it's worse still. The universe can and will create itself. Well, now, suppose I say to you, X creates Y. What does that mean? Well, it means that if you have X, then you get Y. So if I say X creates X, what does that mean? Well, it says if I have X, then I'll get X. Well, nonsense. That is sheer nonsense. And what does that prove? It proves, ladies and gentlemen, that nonsense remains nonsense, even if a high-powered physicist is talking it. Now, I'm not meaning to mock my colleagues. What staggers me is the absurdity to which they go to avoid the obvious. Krauss, to quote him again, has this sentence in his book: because something is physical, nothing must be physical, especially if it's defined as the absence of something. Pardon? Because something is physical, nothing must be physical, especially if it's defined as the absence of something. That's nonsense, of course, philosophical, common sense nonsense. What's the problem? The problem is the desperate drive to get something for nothing. And now the new expedient is to redefine nothing. Now, nothing, I mentioned to you, I was debating Alan Guth in a very friendly fashion in MIT in the faculty club. And I took the liberty of saying, "Alan, I've got a question for you." I said, there's a lot of confusion in many people's minds about what you cosmologists are saying. Because the word nothing to us ordinary people means absence of something. If I say I went down the street in Ljubljana and I saw nobody, it does not mean I saw somebody called nobody. It means I didn't see anybody. Your English is very impressive. You see. You don't mean that. You don't mean that the universe started in absence of anything. No, he says we do not. What we mean is something like a quantum vacuum, which is certainly not nothing. I said, thank you very much. So here's a book. Here are arguments that are supposed to abolish God that couldn't abolish God even if they were true, but they are based on a series of false assumptions and assertions, not only false but meaningless. They don't even rise to the dignity of being false. What am I to do with that? What am I to do with that? Well, I'm concerned about it because not every statement by a scientist is a statement of science. And the authority of science is such. I was moved to write a book on this topic by a young man who, got some petrol in his car, and there was a newspaper article. Stephen Hawking says there's no God. And he was physically shaken. He was in his early 20s. And he wrote to me and he said, "Who am I, little me? If Stephen Hawking says there's no God, what hope have I of being right?" Ladies and gentlemen, I may get many things wrong, but I do want to step into this arena and point out, as I did to that young man, that it's not as it seems to be. There are very powerful arguments for the existence of God. Now, I'm going to finish by making another point. It is a major point, but I'm going to make it briefly, because one of the things that's happened in science is, A, it's been very successful, but B, it has left out the mind that's doing the science. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, it starts, oddly enough, with Charles Darwin, who had a famous doubt. And he was doubting the powers of the human mind because, as he suggested, the human mind, he believed, was descended from lower animal minds. And he put it this way: "With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy." Now think about that for a moment. I do science with my mind. What is my mind? Well, the reductionist atheist says my mind is my brain, full stop. Okay? What is my brain, I ask him. Well, my brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. Well, why would I trust it then? I mean, if you knew that your computer that you use every day was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, you wouldn't use it, would you? Now, this problem has been addressed and is currently being addressed philosophically, not simply by Christian philosophers, but by atheist philosophers. And a book has dropped like a bomb in circles in America and around the world just recently. It's by a very eminent American philosopher called Thomas Nagel. Thomas Nagel's an atheist. He doesn't want there to be a God, and he's honest about it. But let me tell you the title of his book. I've never seen a more provocative title, not this century or last century. It's this: Mind and Cosmos. Why the neo-Darwinian view of the universe is almost certainly false. He's been accused of being a heretic. There's a huge internet discussion about him. But you can't dismiss Thomas Nagel too readily. And his point is very easy to make. It's Darwin's point. He says, if the mental is not itself merely physical, it cannot be fully explained by physical science. That's a simple point, isn't it? Naturalism, that philosophy, implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which evolutionary naturalism itself depends. Let me put that another way, because it's so important. This is Alvin Plantinga, another distinguished American philosopher. If Dawkins is right, he says, that we are the product of mindless, unguided processes, then he has given us strong reason to doubt the reliability of human cognitive faculties, and therefore, inevitably, to doubt the validity of any belief that they produce, including Dawkins' own science and his atheism. Now, here comes the point. Listen very carefully to this. His biology, on the one hand, and his belief in naturalism would therefore appear to be at war with each other in a conflict that has nothing at all to do with God. Putting that briefly, it's saying this: the theory that the mind is the brain, is the end product of mindless, unguided processes, undermines the whole of science. It is a philosophy that doesn't only shoot itself in the foot, it shoots itself in the head. And ladies and gentlemen, I must say it's one of my major arguments for not being an atheist. Let me conclude by thinking again of these two major worldviews. They are diametrically opposed. The one says, in the beginning, well, nothing, a quantum vacuum, mass energy, whatever. And everything else is derivative from that beginning. There's no transcendence. There's no guiding mind. So it all comes from whatever was there in the beginning, plus nothing. The other worldview goes like this: in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things came to be through him, and without him nothing came to be that came to be. In the naturalistic worldview, mass energy is primary. Everything else, mind and person, is derivative. In the other worldview, mind is primary, the Logos, the Word, God, and everything else is derivative. And ladies and gentlemen, it is not only as a Christian but as a scientist that I prefer the biblical explanation to the atheist one. Thank you very much indeed.
Dr. Lennox, we thank you for your challenging, informative, interesting, and fun talk. And I'm sure that many of us have not heard so much science in such a brief time with so much fun and enthusiasm. So we thank you for your kindness to come here. And at this point, we'll give the audience a chance to ask some questions. Pri sebi imate listke, ki ste jih dobili na začetku prihodu, in dali vam bomo nekoliko minut, približno 3-4 minutke, da si vzamete čas, če do zdaj niste imeli priložnosti napisati kakšno vprašanje. Če imate kakšno vprašanje, ga napišite. Še enkrat vas prosimo, da bo čitljivo, da bomo lahko predali dr. Lennoxu, da bo lahko odgovarjal na vaše vprašanja. Se pravi, približno 3-4 minute za vaše vprašanja, potem jih bodo hostese pobrale. Če jih lahko potem prenesete soseda na drugo stran, tako da bodo hostese lahko prinesle vprašanja na oder. Hvala za vašo prijaznost in približno po 3 minutah bomo začeli z vprašanji.
Okay, shall I start?
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, you are about to experience eternity. I have received so many questions that I am greatly flattered to think that you would believe that I could answer them. Now, this is a Q&A, ladies and gentlemen. Now, what does that mean? Because as I look at all of these, I could and would think it was necessary to give you a lecture on each one. I can't do that. So you're going to find this inadequate for two reasons. One, that we can't deal with all the questions, although I'm collecting questions to write a book about questions, so they won't be lost. But secondly, I can only give you little impulses, the way I would begin to think about some of these questions. The real work is for you to do, and that's exciting work. So realize that what we're about to embark on is an inadequate exercise, and you will rapidly learn how little I know. So with that understanding, we will start. And we will start with this. So God created Henry Ford and so forth and so forth. Where does it end? What created God? Are we simply to believe he is eternal? Now, this question actually appears in Stephen Hawking's book. It came from Professor Peter Singer when I debated him in Australia. It came from Richard Dawkins, and it's also in the Austrian Profil magazine. The argument is this: if you believe that God created the universe, surely that's ridiculous, because it doesn't explain anything, because you're going to have to ask who created God. Who created the creator? Then you're going to have to ask who created the creator that created the creator, and so on, ad absurdum. So let's forget God and go back to football. Now, I just want to analyze that question because, interestingly enough, I find it coming up a lot now in schools where people have learned it from Richard Dawkins. It's a matter of logical analysis, I think, to understand it. It's an important question, actually. Who or what created X? What does that question mean? More importantly, what does it assume? What created X, or who created X? That assumes, before you start, that X was created. Philosophers have a name for that kind of question. They call it a complex question because it hides assumptions. So if you ask who created the creator, you're immediately saying the creator was created. But I've never met a monotheist who believes that the creator was created. Because the claim in the Bible is the creator is eternal. He was never created. So to ask the question, who or what created the creator, is meaningless because it assumes what isn't the case in the first place. That's point number one. Point number two is this. When Richard Dawkins in the debate mentioned this to me, I said, okay, you think it's a meaningful question. Well, it is for created God. So let me go round the other way. You believe that the universe created you. So let me ask you your question. Who created your creator? I'm still waiting for the answer. The third point to be made is this. The questions do not go back forever on either side. I have colleagues that say, for us, the universe, the multiverse, is a brute fact. That's where we stop. As a Christian, I stop the questioning with God. You see, what this is about philosophically is the existence and nature of ultimate reality. And the question is not, is there an ultimate reality? The question is, which reality is ultimate? And the answer to that must, in the end, rest on evidence. Does it make more sense, for instance, to believe that mass energy is the ultimate reality, or an intelligent God is the ultimate reality? Well, I believe the intelligent God makes more sense because assuming that mass energy is the ultimate reality has all the problems inherent in it which I've been trying to explain to you all evening. It leads to absurdity, it leads to a denial of rationality, and so on. But I would emphasize here is each of us makes our own decision on the basis of the available evidence. There is no mathematical proof. Just as, well, let me tell you about my wife. I've been married to her for 45 years. but I couldn't prove to you mathematically that she loves me. I'd stake my life on it, though. There are different kinds of evidence than mathematical, you see. And it's good to remember that analogy because, and this is beside the point here, God, ladies and gentlemen, is not a theory, he's a person. Tell us about Aunt Matilda, please. Well, my Aunt Matilda, who is non-existent, and a figment of my imagination, has become famous. And Aunt Matilda is an analogy that I use in order to explain the limits of science. And I imagine, here's Aunt Matilda, and she's baked a beautiful cake. And she sets it on the table there. And you are the Nobel Prize winners of this year. So I ask you to, I'm the MC, I ask you to analyze this cake, and the chemists and the biochemists and the physicists, no mathematicians because there's no Nobel Prize for mathematics, but never mind. Analyze this cake, and we've got a wonderful collection of analyses. And then I have a final question. I say, ladies and gentlemen, tell me why she made it. And she starts to smile. Of course, she knows why she made it. Physicist, why did she make it? Well, it's made of, not what it's made of. Why did she make it? Physics cannot tell you, nor can chemistry, and so on. In fact, you will never know unless she reveals it to you. Now, here's the interesting thing. If she reveals it to you, does that shut your mind down and your rationality? Of course not. When she reveals it to you, you will use your mind to see if her revelation makes sense. And that, incidentally, ladies and gentlemen, explains why I do not think revelation as a concept, God's revelation at the higher level, contradicts rationality. Of course it doesn't. What I am claiming is there's more than one source of information. We have, well, Roger Bacon, the father of modern science, talked about God's two books, the book of science and the book of nature and the book of God's word. You use your reason on both. You don't shut your reason off. Of course not. So that's what Aunt Matilda is all about. Now, gentlemen, the next question. I'm just taking these ones in the middle. Shall I take this one? Well, there are two here. Why do very intelligent people reject God? Well, actually, we shouldn't laugh at this. And I mean that seriously. Many of my friends reject God because of the suffering in this world and because of their experience of it. And if you've stood in Auschwitz, as I have many times, you will understand why some people reject God. I have every sympathy, ladies and gentlemen, with people who find it very difficult to believe in God because of that human experience. And because that is a very personal thing to answer, I'm going to leave it for a while because it'll skew our discussion. It's not the main point of our talk tonight, but I will come back to it, and will you gentlemen remind me of it? There are all kinds of reasons for rejecting God. Arguments, personal experiences, and so on. But there's a related question came, which I will address now. Why don't your atheist friends change their minds in spite of the evidence? I'm very interested that the questioner knows that they don't change their minds, but they do. I get dozens of emails all the time from people who've shifted from atheism to Christianity. Sometimes, I'm delighted to say, even through watching my debates with Dawkins and these other people, of course you can change your mind. You see, let me put it this way. People meet me and they hear I'm from Northern Ireland and they say, oh, well, of course he believes in God. They all believe in God over there. And they fight about it, you know. And when I got to Cambridge, that was one of my biggest questions. And in fact, I was asked it in the first week. A student said to me, do you believe in God? And he said, oh, sorry, I should never have asked you that question. You're Irish and a whole lot of you believe in God and you fight about it and kill each other. Now, of course, I'd heard that before, but it changed my life. I learned German and I learned Russian. Do you know why? Well, mainly so that I could go and talk to see what systematic atheism did to cultures. I spent my whole life doing it. During the Cold War, I was many times per year talking to people. And after the wall fell, many visits to Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and so on. Talking to people. Why, ladies and gentlemen? Because I want to know. And I've discovered that one of the ways to learn is to expose your belief to people that don't share it. And the relationship to this question is, I've seen many people change their minds. In various directions, of course. Of course it's possible to change your worldview. That's one of the exciting things about being a university student. You get a chance to learn and to feed in. Every person in this room tonight has a worldview. And it's usually one of three possibilities, just those. Either you are an atheist, you believe there's no God, or you believe there is a God, or you're a pantheist who believes that God exists but is equal to the universe, or you're a skeptic, and you might be a skeptic in any one of those three. That's, roughly speaking, very crudely, the range of possibilities. And it's important for us to ask the question, why do we hold our worldview? So I just think the questioner here is making a false assumption. Gentlemen, any more that you've translated?
Upbringing, science at school, how to respond.
Well, right. What can I say to my child about science and faith in light of what she's being taught in school? What can she say in class? Now, a question like that is very difficult for me because I'm not a Slovenian and I know nothing about your education system. And it would be to insult you for me to make any assumptions about it. But the formulation of the question is very revealing. What can I say to my child about science and faith? I wonder what is meant by faith in that question. Is it that we've got science here and faith there? Because that reveals to me a misunderstanding. What is faith? Well, I know what Richard Dawkins thinks it is. It's a religious concept and it means believing where there's no evidence. That's nonsense. Faith is an ordinary word that means trust. It comes in English from the Latin fides, which means trust, reliability. And faith is an essential part of science. So when you say science or faith or science and faith, I'm not sure what is being talked about. But I understand it because faith has become, sadly, a shorthand for belief in God and religion, as if science didn't rest on faith. But of course it does. I said that, but not in so many words at the beginning of my lecture. I said that Newton and Kepler believed that science could be done. They had faith that the universe was rational. Every scientist has that faith, and Einstein said so explicitly. I cannot imagine a scientist without that faith. I cannot give you guidance, but I was fortunate. My parents never went to university. But they had the goodness to allow me and to encourage me to think. And they had the sense to feed me good literature so that I could compare it with what I read in school. And I don't know what's taught here. I can imagine, of course, that in some schools, certainly in Britain, people are taught a worldview. Some schools have a Christian background, some have an Islamic background, and many have an atheist background. And what I would encourage parents to do is A, never suppress your kids' questions. B, take them seriously, because they will know if you don't know the answers. C, be honest if you don't know the answers. Many young people are asking questions today that their parents never had to face. And it's very important that your relationship with your child is on the level. I don't understand that, son, but let's have a look at it together and see can we sort it out. That will develop a very close relationship with your child. And I appeal to you parents. I'm a grandfather of 7 and I'm a parent, and it's not easy being a parent. You're going to have to do some hard work. You're going to have to get your eyes away from the television and invest it in thinking about these things in order to help your kids. It is desperately important. So that's all I can say about that. Are you going to feed me something else? Yeah, okay. Right.
There are some personal questions in terms of why you're a Christian.
Yeah, I'll do that towards the end. How much time have we got?
Philosophical kind of one.
Oh, let's have a philosophical one. Well, this relates to the earlier thing. You argued that the universe cannot emerge from itself, but isn't that exactly what God did? No. I claim that God has always existed. I used to go to Russia a lot, ladies and gentlemen, and it's very interesting. In fact, I find I can understand a little bit of your language, just a little bit, as I listen to it. And in the Academy of Sciences, I used to meet this question, who created the creator? Didn't the creator emerge from himself and all this kind of thing? And I was fascinated about that because in those days, when I said to them, well, tell me about the universe, many would say it's always been there. Oh, I said, you do believe in something eternal then. So why do you have a difficulty in believing in an eternal God? Is your problem with believing in an eternal person? So what it's going to come down to, in principle, science can't tell you either way, whether there's an eternal God or an eternal universe. They've come down on the side of the universe not being eternal. And that's the fascinating thing, because it raises the question of creation instantly, as we saw tonight. The universe not eternal, its derivative, God eternal. And why would one come to believe that? Well, the first thing is, does it make sense? Does it make sense of the evidence? And that would lead me, and will lead me in a minute or two, onto more specific questions of how we conceptualize God. Because one of these questions here, somewhere in the middle, I noticed, said, well, you know, if you think of the scientific argument, you get, well, perhaps you get to an intelligent God, but can you get any further than that by studying nature? My answer to that is not very much further. And even Christianity recognizes that. The Apostle Paul said that what is visible from creation, we can perceive by looking at it two things. One, that there is a God, and two, that he's powerful. That's all. To go further than that, to advance to the nature of God, I think the question was, can you find out from science about the actual nature of God? And my answer to that is not very much. Just what I have said. So if you're going to go further than that, and that's what the question asks, how do you go further than that? You have to bring in other disciplines. Remember what I said at the beginning, that science is not the only way to truth. What about history and experience? We've got to bring those in. What about the concept of revelation I mentioned just a little while ago? There's nothing in science that contradicts the concept of revelation. We all know about revelation at the personal level. If you want to get to know me, and I never speak, you'll never get to know me. You can put me under the most powerful scanning, tunneling microscope that you've got. You'll never get to know me unless I reveal myself. And so the big question here in this kaleidoscope of questions is, if there is a creator, has he spoken? Has he revealed himself? Now, of course, you know as well as I do that the central claim of Christianity is that God has spoken in a very specific way. We humans, the claim is, are created in his image, and he has revealed himself by himself becoming human. Oh, you say, how absurd. How absurd. Surely you don't believe that. Now, one of the questions here is, can God break the laws of nature? Are miracles possible? And that's a very important question. I was once addressing 600 physicists in Britain, and they listened to my talk, and one very bright physicist said at the end, he said, Professor Lennox, that was all very interesting, but you know, I perceive that you're a Christian. I said, you're really sharp. And he said, now, he said, let's be honest. He said, this is crazy. If you're a Christian, you're obliged to believe that Jesus was God become human. Isn't that right? I said, absolutely right. He said, can you explain that to me? Well, I said, you've been asking all the questions. Can I ask you a few easier ones first as a physicist? Sure, he said. So I said, tell me, what is consciousness? I don't know. Okay, I said, let's take an easier thing. What is energy? Well, he said, we can measure it and use it. I said, that wasn't the question. You know it wasn't the question. What is energy? I don't know. Neither does the Nobel Prize winner Richard Feynman, by the way. Oh, I said, you don't know what they are. Tell me, do you believe in them? He said, yes. You believe in consciousness and you believe in energy. And you don't know what they are. I said, you're crazy, man. I said, I'll write you off as a physicist. He said, please don't. Well, I said, listen, you were prepared to write me off because I couldn't explain to you the deepest mystery in the universe, how God become human. And you can't explain these vastly simpler things. I said, let's pursue this a bit further. I said to him, why do you believe in these things when you don't know what they are? Well, that was a difficulty. So being very kind, I helped him. And I said, I think one of the reasons you believe in those concepts is that they have explanatory power. He said, that's right. Well, I said, that's one of the reasons I believe that Jesus was both God and human. I don't understand it. We don't even know what gravity is. But I believe it because it's the only explanation of the phenomena that makes sense. And now we come down to the final, what must be the final questions, because I'm getting old and you're getting tired. And they all circle around this idea. Most of the questions, actually, it interests me greatly. As far as I can see, most of the questions are about this topic. And there are, why, how would you be a Christian? Why aren't you a member of some other religion? And so on and so forth. Now, I understand the question very well. It's not actually on our agenda tonight. The topic was, I believe, gentlemen, the Higgs boson, the God of the gaps. But here I have a problem because the main question that you've asked me has got nothing to do with the topic. It's a very personal question. Why are you a Christian? Would you mind if I give you a personal answer? Those who aren't interested, just go to sleep for 5 minutes, all right? And for the rest of you, I will attempt to give a personal answer. But I'm going to contextualize it. Because I said that the hardest problem I face is what makes many of my friends atheists. It's the problem of suffering and evil. Now, if you're interested in detail what I'd say about it, just Google my name in New Zealand. Because I arrived in New Zealand 2 days after the Christchurch earthquake. I had to meet men who'd lost their wives, women who'd lost their husbands. I had to speak, give interviews on radio, television for a solid 2 weeks. I had to change all my lectures. Earthquake, why? So I'm not going to be able to go into detail, ladies and gentlemen. But it will help me to explain 2 things. How I face that question and why I am a Christian. I've sat with many people who've told me the exact point at which they gave up belief in God. And it usually has to do with some awful experience of suffering. And very often they very kindly say to me, I'm sorry if that upsets you, but I just can't believe in God. So I say to them often something like this. All right then, there isn't a God. Suffering is just a brute fact of existence. And indeed, the vast majority of people will suffer. And some of it is out of all proportion to what we would think deserve. So there is no God, and you just have to accept it. So you've removed the intellectual problem by rejecting the existence of God. But please notice that you haven't removed the suffering. It's still there. Please notice also that you've removed all hope. Now, I actually still believe in God. You don't have the problem. You've solved it by saying there isn't a God. I still have the problem because I still believe in God. Do you want to know why? And they usually say, we'd love to know why. Let's get to the heart of it. The very heart of the Christian faith, there's a cross. The claim is, now you may disagree with it, but if you're going to understand this, you must at least try to think along with the claim and see what sense it makes. The claim is that the one who hung on that cross 20 centuries ago is God incarnate. What is God doing on a cross, ladies and gentlemen, on planet Earth? What that tells me, at the very least, is that God has not remained distant from the problem of human suffering, but has himself become part of it. That's point number one. That gives hope, and I've known so many people. It's not a simplistic solution, because what you've got to realize is when it comes to suffering, it is one thing to be a professor of oncology. It is another thing to be a young mother of 30 who's been told she's 3 months to live because she's got terminal cancer. It looks very different from the academic chair to the hospital bed. And we've got to be so sensitive. And I'm aware that in an audience this size, there are many people who are hurting desperately. So I'm going to try to be as sensitive as I can, but it's going to have to be compressed. Is God really like that? That he comes so close to suffering that he himself suffers? Well, if that were the end of the story, of course, but it isn't. The next bit is that Jesus rose from the dead. I believe that as a scientist. I believe it on the basis of the historical evidence to start with, and on the personal evidence to finish with. I haven't time to argue it, but if you want to read what I as a scientist think are the arguments, firstly for the possibility of miracle, and secondly for the actuality of the resurrection, may I just refer to my most recent book, Gunning for God, which may appear in Slovenian in the future, where I tried to answer those questions as a scientist. But let's just come along with me to see what sense it makes. Ladies and gentlemen, there's another thing that bothers me about life. It's the concept of justice and morality. Is there such a thing as justice? I talked to Dawkins about this in public. And he said, well, we ought to work for justice in this world. Of course we did. But ladies and gentlemen, let's be realistic. The vast majority of people who've ever lived will never see justice. They don't get it in this life, and if there's no other life, they'll never get it. It will prove to have been an illusion, the very concept. Is that so? Every fiber in our body cries out that there's something wrong here because we discover ourselves to be moral beings. The claim is that Christ rose from the dead. He's broken the death barrier. He has potentially abolished death. Death is not the end. And that opens up the possibility for hope and ultimate justice. Do you know the early Christian preachers, one of the things they mentioned again and again was that the resurrection of Christ from the dead, literally, was evidence that he'd been appointed to be the final judge. The morality makes sense because there will be an ultimate judgment, but that's here where the final problem comes. How am I going to face that? I can't even keep my own standards, let alone God's standards. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I've been asked about other religions here. I have friends in every religion. So let me say something about that. Why am I a Christian and not in one of the other religions. Let me say two things in closing. Number one is this. This debate can get very unfortunately heated and disrespectful. So the first thing to realize is the common morality that we experience in all philosophies and religions. I don't know whether you've ever noticed it, but every single philosophy and religion that I've ever researched has got the golden rule. Do unto others as you would they did unto you. Why is that? Well, from a Christian perspective, it's because whether we believe in God or not, we've been created in the image of God as moral beings. So when I look at you, whether you believe in God or not, ladies and gentlemen, I believe you're made in the image of God, and therefore you're of infinite value. So I better be careful what I say about you or to you. That is, my Christian faith gives you an eternal value that's immeasurable. That's number one. It also means that some of my non-Christian friends or friends in other religions can put me to shame by their behavior. I've got to face that and recognize it. Now, do you know what I've discovered? I've discovered that when you admit and face that, people of all religions are very open to talk to you, because the discussion is not implying that they're morally inferior. And then we can discuss our differences. Let me illustrate one. My Jewish friends believe that Jesus died and never rose. My Muslim friends believe he never died. I believe he both died and rose. Those three views are mutually contradictory. I've never had any difficulty talking about that to my friends out of all those religions, because I'm not disrespecting them as men and women. And to decide the difference, I know no other way but evidence. My final point is this. What is the major difference? And now I'm going to make an abstraction, but you'll understand it. And it's this. I discover as I look at religions and philosophies that they're basically of two kinds. The first kind is there is a way, there are rules, there are regulations, there are laws to be kept. You try to keep these laws as best you can through life, and there comes at the end an assessment based on your merit. And acceptance depends on your merit. It's like a university in Ljubljana, actually. There's an entrance, you get in, but even the professors, however kind they are, cannot guarantee that you're going to come out with a degree. It depends on your merit. And that means, of course, that if you're in your first year and you say, you know, I'm going to get a first-class honors degree, your friends are going to say you're jolly arrogant. You can't be sure until the final exam. I meet many people who believe God's like that. He's given them some kind of way or plan. They try to do the best they can. They never can be sure that God will accept them because it depends on their merit. Do you understand that? Now, here is where Christianity is utterly revolutionary. It does not teach that, ladies and gentlemen, although some versions of it appear to. What Christianity teaches is we'll never do it that way. You cannot earn God's forgiveness. You cannot merit it. But you can receive it as a free gift. That's a wonderful thing. But you know, it stands to life. Let me tell you about my wife again. Sorry, but she's wonderful. Suppose I met her, and I met her on day one in Cambridge, and she was 16. I shouldn't have told you that either. But there we are. Suppose I said, you know, I would love you to be my wife. Now, of course, I couldn't accept you now. So here it is. Here's a cookbook, and it's full of laws. If you keep all these laws for, let's say, 30 or 40 years and earn enough money to keep me in the way to which I'm accustomed, then I will think about accepting you. Is that okay? Well, I can see the women especially saying how insulting. Wait a minute. That is how many people think about God. I'll keep the rules. I'll try. And maybe you'll accept me. We would never insult a fellow human being by treating them like that. What did I do? Well, I accepted her, and she, for some reason, accepted me right at the beginning. And that was the secret of our relationship. And ladies and gentlemen, I make no apology for this, because it's the biggest thing in my universe by far. And you asked me the question, although it's nothing to do with the topic. The biggest thing in my universe by far is that I have come to know a God through Jesus Christ, who loved me and gave himself for me, and is prepared at the beginning now to accept me, not because of my merit, but because of his, and because of what he has done. And it's that that sets me free to live, that knowledge, that certainty, that I have that relationship, that death itself will not destroy. Ladies and gentlemen, no other religion competes with that, because no other religion offers me what Jesus does. And therefore I do not count it arrogance to accept from him what is on offer nowhere else. But that's a big topic for another time. And with that, I must stop. Thank you very much indeed.
Dr. Lennox, thank you very, very much for the wonderful answers. You've given us a lot to think about, lots of things to chew over, and a lot of good humour amongst it all. Thank you so much. And although it's a tradition in Slovenia that actually a woman should give a gift, in this case, I asked two women, and both of them said no. And I don't understand why. I think he's very cuddly, and Ben, you could give him a cuddle instead, maybe, I don't know.
There's a story behind that, ladies and gentlemen. Let me just tell you a secret. When I was at the University of Wales, we used to ask the students why they came to our department. And one girl was being interviewed by me, and I said, "Why did you come to our institute?" And she opened the handbook of the institute, and she opened a page where there was a picture of me talking to some students. And she said, "I came here because you look like Father Christmas."
You'll find in there not just chocolates and wine and things that we know you enjoy, but also some good reading from one of the earliest things written in the Slovene language by Primož Trubar, a great thinker whose thoughts and hard work brought lots of blessings to the Slovene people. And so we hope that you will enjoy that reading, and I think you'll find a lot in common as well, very much. Gospod Hlasten, tudi vam, hvala lepa za vašo pomoč pri vprašanjih. Pa Svetopisemski družbi Slovenije še posebej zahvaljujemo za stojnico v avli in tam lahko kupite svetopismo, razne izdaje so na razpolago, tudi angleški izvod God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God, 10 €. Lahko tudi izpolnite naročilnico za slovensko verzijo, ki bo kmalu izšla. Cena je 17,5 €. V načrtu je tudi priprava nocojšnjega dogodka na DDV-ju. S podnapisi. Na koncu se moram tudi vam, poslušalcem, zahvaliti za pozornost in ne samo zanimiva vprašanja, ampak ogromno vprašanj. Hvala lepa vam. želim vam še naprej lep in prijeten večer.